Hello again, Dan Alasso, Making History. And today I'm going to read to you once again from my biography of Dr. Charles Knowlton called An Infidel Body Snatcher and the Fruits of His Philosophy. And today I'm going to read two chapters because chapter 4 is super short. So I'll read to chapter 4, which is called Take Care, and chapter 5, which is called Tabitha. So, beginning with chapter 4, as I always do, a quote from Knowlton's memoir. I had found that my disease was worse after having exercised the previous day. So I was very careful not to over-exercise. At length, to aid me in being cautious, I printed with pen upon a piece of paper in large capitals the words "Take Care," and fastened it upon the cuff of my coat sleeve. This excited some attention. Many asked me the object of it, and I used to wish that people would mind their own business. And now my narrative. By the time he turned 20, Charles Knowlton was so weak and so afraid that he rarely left his room. He was weak from the medicines he took daily and from avoiding work and exercise. He was afraid because he believed his disease was worsening and, quote, could see no reasonable prospect of my getting well. After all, nearly a dozen doctors had been unable to cure him during the 3 years he had suffered. Charles nearly gave up. He stopped venturing out and spent his time huddled by a warm fire. In his most hopeful moments, Charles clung to the belief that he would somehow get well. A big part of this hope was that he would be able to leave his parents' home and make his own way in the world. But Charles had, quote, no conception of how this would be. By this time, the people of Templeton had learned of Charles's malady. Rumors of his illness added to observations about the boy's oddness, and townspeople concluded that Charles was a very strange character. Seeing Charles on his rare ventures outdoors must have been eerie. He was a tall, pale, emaciated young man, walking slowly about the town. His careful movements and the note pinned to his sleeve must have convinced many of his neighbors that Charles had finally lost his sanity as well as his health. And apparently, they had no trouble expressing their opinions and meddling in what Charles considered none of their business. Charles realized that the worse he got, the farther he was from a cure. He began to suspect that he might never be cured. And his physicians, quote, favored this idea. After all, they hadn't been able to help him with their poisons and moralizing. So clearly he was a hopeless case. Charles was not in much pain, but deep in a depression he later remembered as a heart-sunken despondency I shall never be able to describe. Charles didn't say much about how his family responded to his illness, but his parents' concern was probably tinged with frustration. Stephen Knowlton was a meticulous record keeper. He had an account book and kept detailed records of what his sons contributed to the family and what he gave them. Charles had not pulled his weight for 3 years. Although Charles never criticized his parents, he did recall his life at home. Quote, a full description of my feelings I have not attempted to give, Charles said. I was at home in my father's house. My parents, with my 2 brothers and myself, composed the family. There was little to divert my attention. There I sat, and there I lay, brooding over my sad case, day after day. The Knowlton family was small by the standards of the day, but Charles's description suggests more than this. It was a family without life or joy. And living with the Knowltons gave Charles nothing to lift his depression or take his mind off the disease he believed was slowly killing him. The Knowltons seem to have been typical 19th century New Englanders, children of the Puritans, cold-blooded Yankees unable to show whatever concern or affection they had for their ailing son. But that's not surprising. This was Massachusetts in 1820. Luckily for Charles, he was about to discover there was another world not far away, and a completely different way to live life and be with people. So that's the end of that chapter, sad chapter. The next chapter is called Tabitha. This is chapter 5. In Knowlton's words, "He had no sons, but 6 daughters, all at home, and all singers, dancers, and adepts in the amusements and pleasures of accomplished and well-educated young women. Many people were about there, and we had checker playing, backgammon, chess, music, and dancing, more or less almost every day and evening. There was the company of the girls also, and then that electorizing business. It put the vital fluid into me, as I was made to believe. Mr. Stewart also had a little black-eyed daughter who used to go to the same school with me and who I well remembered." Now my story. In January 1821, a former neighbor of the Knowltons, named Richard Stewart, visited Stephen Knowlton to talk about Charles. Richard Stewart was known throughout the area as, quote, "an ingenious mechanic," whose tinkering had led to several practical inventions, such as the improved water-powered sawmill used by many local lumbermen. Charles described Stewart as, quote, "a jack of all trades, and in several respects somewhat singular." Coming from Charles Knowlton, that's high praise, and a suggestion that Stewart really was quite unusual. Richard Stewart was intelligent and well regarded in the neighborhood. A respectable citizen like Selectman Stephen Knowlton would listen carefully to his advice. Not long after their conversation, Stewart visited the Knowlton home on a winter evening and was shown into the room where Charles lay brooding by the fire. Richard Stewart was no stranger to Charles. He had lived close to the Knowltons until Charles was 10 or 12. Charles had not forgotten Stewart and had often hoped to see him again. As a boy, Charles had spent hours watching the inventor tinkering in his workshop. Stewart apparently saw something in Charles as well. Charles remembered the older man, quote, "would let me in, pinch my fingers moderately with his nippers, and then laugh at my fright." The Stewarts had moved about since leaving Templeton, before finally settling in nearby Winchendon. The village of Winchendon, about 7 miles from the Knowlton farm, was a community of woodworkers, especially toy makers. These craftsmen probably appreciated Stewart's inventiveness. Richard Stewart told the Knowltons he was in Templeton on some mechanical job, but he may have come primarily to see Charles. Stewart had been studying the medical use of electricity, and he had built his own, quote, electrical machine that he was eager to test out. Charles had always been interested in Stewart's tinkering, so he was an ideal subject, especially since nearly all the local doctors had already declared him incurable. Medical electricity was an unusual interest for a village inventor in 1821 Massachusetts, but not unheard of. About the time Ben Franklin flew his kite in Philadelphia in 1752, natural scientists in Europe and America became fascinated by the, quote, animal electrical economy. Although it would be over a century before electricity became a household necessity, friends of Franklin's, such as Dr. Erasmus Darwin in England and Joseph Priestley, who left England for America in 1794, began experimenting and writing about their findings. Darwin was the grandfather of Charles Darwin and one of several people who wrote about evolution decades before his grandson's famous theory. Joseph Priestley was one of the discoverers of the element oxygen. Priestley was hounded out of his native Britain by religious rioters who demolished his home and laboratory after the freethinker said some unpopular things about the church. The fact that the scientists studying electricity were not religious men probably had a lot to do with Richard Stewart's interest in the subject. Stewart was a freethinker. the first of many who would come into Charles Knowlton's life. Freethinkers believed that truth was found through experience and thought, and not through faith and revelation. Although some 19th century freethinkers believed the universe had a creator, they all rejected a personal God who did miracles and took an interest in human affairs. Freethinkers agreed that all religious texts were written by men, and thus had no more authority than other man-made theories. They prized reason and revered people who had the courage to challenge orthodox dogmas. Richard Stuart's interest in Charles may have been based on his suspicion that Knowlton, known far and wide for his illness, but also for his oddness and his talent as a mathematician, might be a kindred spirit. A few days after Richard Stuart's visit to the Knowlton home, Stephen Knowlton wrapped his son in buffalo robes and drove him to the Stuarts' house in Winchendon. After 3 years of expensive consultations and ineffective treatments, Charles's family could see no hope of a conventional cure. Richard Stuart was pleased, if not proud, Knowlton said, to have him for a patient. Although he wasn't a doctor, Stuart, quote, pried into the nature of my case, asking detailed questions about Knowlton's symptoms and his reactions to the medications he'd been given. Stuart's questions surprised Charles. Unlike the doctors Charles had seen, Stuart was not above gathering empirical evidence and seeing where it led him. Also, unlike the physicians who had treated Charles, Richard Stuart, quote, took much pains to divert my mind and cheer me up. In addition to being an inventor, Stuart was a talented musician who played several instruments, including the violin. Stuart played music for Charles and then taught Charles to play the violin himself. After a lifetime spent in a lifeless, puritanical home, the music and laughter of the Stuart household were shocking for the young man. Years later, Charles would make a point of practicing his violin on Sabbath mornings by an open window to entertain the faithful on their way to church. While Richard Stuart treated his patient with his electorizing machine and taught him music, he exposed Charles for the first time to free thought. Stuart, quote, possessed Paine's Age of Reason and spoke highly of it, Charles said. But Charles refused to read Thomas Paine's most controversial book. He'd been taught in his church and his Orthodox home that the Age of Reason was blasphemy. Quote, I supposed it to be a bad book, Charles said, and its author a very wicked man. Gradually, Charles's respect for Stuart drove him to re-examine his beliefs and question the truths that he'd been taught. Like many 18th century freethinkers, Thomas Paine had objected to organized religion, but had retained his belief in an impersonal higher power. Richard Stuart took free thought a step further and rejected the spirit altogether. Unlike Paine, Stuart was a materialist. Stuart accepted no supernatural miracles, insisting that nature could be understood completely by studying causes and effects in the observable world. But in those days, I knew not what materialism is, Charles said. I remember asking him one day what he supposed becomes of the soul when a person dies. To Charles's utter shock, quote, he gave me no answer but this: what becomes of the blaze of a candle when you blow it out? The Stuarts had no sons, but they had 6 daughters. The oldest girl, Tabitha, was 17, and the youngest, Emmeline, was 4. The girls were all bright, talented, and happy. And as a freethinker, Stuart believed none of his neighbors' repressive traditions that would have prevented him from teaching the girls music, science, and whatever else they cared to learn. Charles was impressed by their poise and their accomplishments, and also by the steady stream of visitors who made the Stuart household, quote, a great and strange novelty. Living with the Stuarts, there was always something to take Charles's mind off his own troubles. From his very first night in Richard Stuart's home, Charles felt as if he'd been transported to quite another world. The change was so complete and so sudden that Charles was shocked out of his depression. He, quote, began to think of other things besides myself and to have new hope. Although Charles had brought a bag full of the prescriptions he'd been taking daily at home, he soon forgot to take them. To my surprise and joy, Charles said, he found that I felt just as well without them. And then there was Tabitha. Charles had remembered the Stuart's oldest daughter as the little black-eyed schoolmate of his childhood. Along with his interest in Richard Stuart's tinkering, she was the reason Charles had hoped to see the Stuarts again. Charles stayed through the rest of the winter with the Stuarts, taking electrical treatments, talking with Richard Stuart about science, philosophy, and religion, and enjoying the family's festive social life. During that winter, Charles's interest in Tabitha became a romance. Although Tabitha was 4 years younger than Charles, turning 17 about the same time he arrived in her parents' home, she was the daughter of freethinkers. Tabitha had no fear of Charles or his oddness, and she felt free to express her interest in him. 3 months after Charles's arrival in Winchendon, and 3 weeks before his 21st birthday, Charles and Tabitha were married. They went directly ahead, Charles said, without consulting anyone. The marriage of two underage people without the consent of their parents was barely legal, and it was completely unheard of in families like the Knowltons. But Charles's health was improving for the first time in 3 years, so they kept their objections to themselves. Charles was still only able to do moderate work, but his disease was gone, and his strength was slowly returning. Over the next few months, Charles and Tabitha split their time between the Stuart and Knowlton households. Charles discovered he had a future and began to make plans for it. He had found his cure at last in Richard Stuart's house. It wasn't electricity. So, that is the end of Chapter 5. I'll return soon with Chapter 6, which is called Body Snatcher. So we'll get to that very soon. But in the meantime, I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you again very soon.